Cape Town now by Phephelaphi Dube, constitutional expert. Thank you for being with us, Ms. Dube. It's largely academic, isn't it? Because the former president can't reconsider the cabinet reshuffle and undo it anyway. But is it still worthy in terms of setting a precedent?
Well, absolutely. It's still worthy in terms of setting a precedent, because we need to bear in mind that this particular question, the question that relates to whether or not South Africa's courts can actually look into the president's power to effect a cabinet reshuffle, is a question that has not been settled by the courts. So in essence, it's very much an area of law which does need clarity. So even if it has become a moot point, even if President Jacob Zuma is no longer in power, but it's certainly an aspect of law which needs the courts to weigh in on decisively so.
And any idea on which way the Supreme Court will go?
Well, it's certainly one of those very difficult cases because there are quite convincing arguments on both sides. The first being obviously bearing in mind the doctrine of separation of powers, which basically recognizes that all of the all of the branches of government rather have their own particular functions and that they shouldn't encroach on their functions. But also bearing in mind, and this comes from a long line of case law which began with the Simelane matter, and was also cemented in matters involving Mcebisi Jonas, involving Lawrence Mcebisi, involving Major General Mcebisi. The courts have made it quite clear that there can't be any kind of exercise of public power which is above the scrutiny of the courts, and that in whatever decision the members of the executive are arriving at, that decision needs to be exercised rationally. And of course, if we consider the aspect of rationality, the courts have made it quite clear that just because you and I would have arrived at a different decision, or indeed, even if that decision has a negative impact for the country, it doesn't mean that that decision on its own is necessarily a wrong decision. But that said, it's just important that the decision makes sense. So in this instance, it would be very important for the court to then look into the reasons that the president has given, that the former president gave for the cabinet reshuffle. And the question would then be if the president relied on that largely discredited intelligence report. And I think we also bits and pieces of that intelligence report where the spelling was bad, the grammar was very bad, and sentences were barely strung together, and the report didn't really appear to make sense. So the question is, on that particular piece of evidence, does it make sense? Is it rational for the president to have then effected a cabinet reshuffle based on a largely discredited piece of evidence? And I think going forward, the former president's lawyers will have a very difficult task in terms of convincing the judges that that kind of document would suffice on a rationality test.
All right, so maybe things have to be fair and rational, but isn't there a danger that we can take away what's called the prerogative of the president to hire and fire? When I think about it, surely a president of all leaders needs to be surrounded by people that he trusts.
Well, I think, again, we also need to explore the idea of a presidential prerogative. And the word prerogative doesn't even appear in the Constitution. The word prerogative is really a word that we've inherited from English common law, and it's a word that implies the Queen or the King's powers. And of course, in South Africa, we're a constitutional democracy. We do not have a king, we do not have a queen. And the manner in which the president exercises their power is always subject to the Constitution. So there can't be any instances in which there are areas in which the manner in which the president conducts himself isn't subject to the Constitution. So on that basis, to talk about a prerogative in the South African context is a bit of a misnomer, because ultimately the president's conduct is always subject to the Constitution. And I think the Constitution is very clear in that regard.
Should the Constitution even go further, put a cap on the number of cabinet reshuffles? I think we saw an unprecedented number of reshuffles under the former president. It disrupts everything in terms of service delivery, in terms of ministers getting on top of their work. I laughed because the army in Zimbabwe said that the former president there, Mugabe, had changed the cabinet. That was one of the reasons for that, at the time, claimed coup. But we dwarfed what was happening in Zimbabwe. Does the Constitution need to think about presidents, future presidents, who could behave like this again?
Well, I'm obviously not in favor of tinkering with the Constitution in order to meet the behavior of a particular individual. I think it's just important for the Constitution to remain as is, because ultimately speaking, there are enough checks and balances within South Africa's constitutional democracy to ensure that there isn't that kind of abuse of power. And of course, if we need to also consider checks and balances such as the reaction of the South African public, we're going into an election year. So the question would be, how does the South African voter feel about these changes? How does the South African voter feel about this chopping and changing of cabinet ministers? So I think any president going forward would obviously need to bear all of these consequences going forward. And I think those dire consequences for the future of a governing party do serve as enough of a check and balance on the president's power.
All right, thank you very much, constitutional expert Phephelaphi Dube, and we'll await that decision by the Supreme Court of Appeal. We'll take a short break.